Hello everyone. When you think of clowns, what comes to mind? Usually, people imagine the funny, cheerful clowns you see at kids' birthday parties. Maybe the ones who twist balloon animals or paint silly faces. Or perhaps you think of a villainous figure, like the infamous clown character from a Marvel comic, the Joker. But what if I told you that some works of art, like the creepy image of the clown, were inspired by something much darker? Something that came from real-life events in the 1970s, a story so chilling, it still gives people goosebumps today. It's the 1970s in the Midwestern United States, in the state of Illinois, home to the bustling city of Chicago, one of the largest cities in the country. Back then, it was also a place where politics and business were tightly knit together. The man at the center of this story was a man named John Wayne Gacy. On the surface, he looked like any other businessman, just another guy trying to make a living. But beneath that friendly, smiling exterior, Gacy hid a dark secret. A secret so shocking, it would eventually label him as one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Gacy was born in Chicago on March 17, 1942. His father was a mechanic, his mother a housewife, and he was the middle child of 3 kids. Growing up, John had a rough time. His childhood was marked by his father's abuse, and the kid struggled to fit in. He didn't have many friends, mostly kept to himself, hanging around his mother and sisters. But things only got worse as he got older. When John was 11 years old, he suffered a serious head injury after a fall while playing. At first, it didn't seem too bad, but as time passed, doctors realized it caused brain damage that would affect him for the rest of his life. Fast forward to his teenage years, and things took a darker turn. At the age of 16, John was diagnosed with a heart condition, a health problem that would plague him into adulthood. But instead of allowing these struggles to break him, John pushed forward. By 18, he was out of high school and working on building his future. John got involved in local politics, working as an assistant for a Democratic politician in his district. He was ambitious and eager to climb the social ladder. At the same time, he started taking odd jobs to support himself, including working as a manager for a fast food restaurant. But his life wasn't all work and no play. In 1964, at the age of 22, John got married to a woman named Marilyn May, and it seemed like everything was coming together. Marilyn's father was wealthy and helped the young couple by buying them a few KFC restaurants. But, as you might expect from someone whose childhood was marked by loneliness and abuse, John's relationships began to unravel. His marriage to Marilyn started falling apart, and by 1969, they were divorced. Despite his personal struggles, John continued to push forward, and by the age of 29, he was back in Chicago, trying to rebuild his life. John became a successful contractor, running his own company, PDM Contractors. At first, the business struggled, but soon enough, he started to gain clients and grow his reputation. He worked hard, often putting in long hours, sometimes more than 16 hours a day. But as his business thrived, his personal life continued to deteriorate. His second marriage ended in 1976, just a few years after it began. His second wife, Carol, left him after learning some unsettling truths about John's behavior. He had begun showing signs of his darker side, an attraction to young men. Now, here's where things get really unsettling. In addition to his work as a contractor, John had another hobby, one that would ultimately define him in the darkest of ways. John Wayne Gacy was not just a businessman. He was also a member of a local community organization, and more chillingly, he was involved in the clown community. Gacy had a secret life that no one knew about. At local charity events and kids' parties, he would dress up as a clown. The children loved him. He was Pogo the Clown, always the center of attention, always putting on a happy face, laughing and entertaining. But behind the painted smile, behind the clown costume, something terrifying was brewing. You see, Gacy was not the cheerful clown he appeared to be. He was hiding a monstrous truth. From 1972 to 1978, John Wayne Gacy kidnapped, tortured, and killed young boys and young men. He lured them into his home with promises of work or money. Once inside, he would subdue them, often using handcuffs, then perform unspeakable acts before ending their lives. Afterward, he would bury their bodies beneath his house or dispose of them in nearby rivers. The community, the people around him, never suspected a thing. To them, Gacy was a pillar of the neighborhood, a hard-working businessman who helped out with local events, a man who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. But underneath the surface, Gacy was hiding a horrific truth. He had become a serial killer, and the bodies were piling up. Now, let's fast forward to December 11, 1978. It was a cold winter night in Chicago when a 15-year-old boy named Robert went missing. His mother had dropped him off at his part-time job at a local pharmacy. But when it came time to pick him up, Robert wasn't there. His mother waited and waited, but by 11 p.m. he still hadn't returned. She was worried, so she called the police. It didn't take long for the authorities to trace the last person who had seen Robert John Wayne Gacy. As it turned out, Robert had met with Gacy earlier that night, under the guise of discussing a job offer. The investigation quickly zeroed in on Gacy as the prime suspect. At first, Gacy denied knowing Robert, but the police weren't buying it. They dug deeper, and what they uncovered was nothing short of horrifying. John Wayne Gacy wasn't just a suspect in Robert's disappearance. He was the monster responsible for a string of murders. But even as the investigation intensified, Gacy maintained his innocence. He kept up the act, portraying himself as the innocent, friendly neighborhood clown. But his lies started to unravel. A search of Gacy's home revealed the unimaginable, a hidden world of death, secrets, and horror. The police found evidence of Gacy's gruesome crimes. They found the bodies buried in the crawlspace under his house. The investigation revealed that Gacy had killed at least 33 young men. Each one of his victims had been lured in, trapped, tortured, and murdered. Some of the bodies were so decomposed that they were barely recognizable. The police were horrified, but the true extent of Gacy's crimes hadn't even fully come to light yet. As the police conducted their search of Gacy's home, the full scale of his depravity became clear. They discovered not only the bodies of his victims buried under the floorboards and in the crawlspace beneath his house, but also photographs, mementos, and evidence that showed just how methodical and sick his crimes had been. There were handwritten notes, drawings, and even items of clothing that belonged to his victims. The police were sickened, but they also had a sense of urgency. They knew that Gacy had been operating for years, and there could be many more missing boys out there whose families still had no answers. The search expanded. Authorities combed through Gacy's property, his home, his garage, his personal items. They found that Gacy had hidden his dark deeds right under the noses of his neighbors and the people who knew him best. He had spent years gaining their trust, presenting himself as a respectable businessman, and yet he was a monster hiding in plain sight. To those around him, Gacy was a well-liked, even charming man. He had hosted neighborhood parties, volunteered for local events, and even campaigned for political office. He had a reputation for being generous, even helping to sponsor local youth programs. Gacy played the role of the upstanding citizen so well that no one ever suspected his dark side. But it was all a carefully constructed lie. Beneath the smile of Pogo, the clown was a man who preyed on vulnerable young men who were either runaways or from troubled backgrounds. Gacy's method was disturbingly consistent. He would lure his victims with promises of work, drugs, or money, often using the guise of his professional role in the community. He would offer them a ride, sometimes even inviting them back to his home to show them a supposed job opportunity or to hang out for a while. Once inside, he would put on handcuffs, claiming he was showing them a trick. Then, he would overpower them, often using chloroform or other forms of restraint, before proceeding to fulfill his twisted fantasies. The brutality of his crimes was matched only by his complete lack of remorse. When the full extent of Gacy's actions became known, the entire nation was in shock. People had seen him at local events, participating in parades as a clown, mingling with children and families, and smiling for photographs. How could someone so normal, so integrated into his community, be capable of such monstrous acts? The psychological horror of it all lay not only in the brutality of his killings, but in the fact that no one, friends, neighbors, or even his wives, ever suspected a thing. Gacy had played his role so well, it was almost as if he had become a part of the town's identity. For years he had manipulated everyone around him, making them believe that he was harmless. The trial that followed was one of the most notorious in American criminal history. Gacy's arrest sparked a nationwide frenzy. The media descended on the small town of Norwood Park, Chicago, where the killings took place, and the details of Gacy's crimes were broadcast to the world. The investigation revealed that Gacy's killing spree had begun as early as 1972, and many of his victims were found to have disappeared under mysterious circumstances. As the bodies were exhumed from Gacy's property, the true extent of his sadism became even clearer. John Wayne Gacy was charged with 33 counts of murder, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. During the trial, Gacy's defense team attempted to argue that he was insane, that his actions had been driven by mental illness. But the prosecution was unrelenting. They presented a mountain of evidence, photographs, witness testimonies, and, most hauntingly, the remains of Gacy's victims. Despite his attempts to manipulate the legal system and avoid responsibility, Gacy's true nature was exposed. As the trial progressed, Gacy continued to maintain his innocence, even though the overwhelming evidence proved otherwise. He claimed that he was the victim of a conspiracy and that his confessions had been coerced, but no one believed him. His demeanor in court was cold and detached, almost as if he were playing a role like a twisted actor in a macabre show. The families of his victims, many of whom had spent years searching for their missing loved ones, finally had the answers they had been desperately seeking. The grief and devastation were immeasurable. The lives of 33 young men had been taken by this monstrous individual, and no amount of justice could bring them back. In March 1980, after months of testimony and deliberation, the jury found John Wayne Gacy guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to death, and his fate seemed sealed. Gacy's crimes were so horrific that the very thought of him ever walking free was unthinkable. However, the process of execution would take years. The legal battles continued as Gacy appealed his sentence, but in the end, his execution was carried out on May 10, 1994. He was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison in California, and his death marked the end of a dark chapter in American criminal history. Although John Wayne Gacy's life ended in 1994, the consequences of his crimes reverberated far beyond the courtroom. Gacy's horrific actions left an indelible mark on the lives of his victims' families, the city of Chicago, and the broader understanding of criminal psychology. The haunting legacy of his murders still casts a shadow over the collective memory, a reminder of how ordinary life can mask the darkest of secrets. The families of Gacy's victims struggled with their grief for years after the murders were discovered. Many of them had waited long and agonizing years, hoping for answers that never seemed to come. Sons, brothers, friends, and lovers had vanished without a trace, and it was only through the relentless work of law enforcement that they were finally brought to justice. But even after Gacy's execution, the trauma of losing loved ones in such a violent, senseless way never truly healed. For these families, justice could not erase the pain of their loss. As the media frenzy surrounding the case ebbed away over time, Gacy's name became synonymous with unspeakable evil, a phrase that carried the weight of his atrocities. His story was told again and again in documentaries, true crime books, and investigative reports. But no amount of press could completely illuminate the psychological darkness that drove Gacy to commit such heinous acts. Scholars and psychologists spent years examining his personality, his life history, and the possible triggers behind his violent urges. Was it a childhood trauma, an intrinsic mental illness, or something far more inexplicable? In the decades that followed his death, many continued to explore these questions, but no definitive answers could ever fully account for the depth of Gacy's malevolence. Some sought to study Gacy's case as a means of understanding the psyche of serial killers. His meticulous methods and chillingly consistent behavior were examined to find patterns among other killers. Some experts believed that Gacy's crimes were fueled by a desire for control, while others suggested he may have had a deep-seated need for domination and humiliation. He had been able to maintain a facade of normalcy, a respected businessman, a volunteer, a man with political aspirations, while hiding a gruesome secret. Despite Gacy's death, his crimes sparked a wave of legal and procedural changes that would ripple through law enforcement for decades. For example, his case led to improved investigation techniques, particularly in how missing persons cases were handled. The way police gathered evidence, the manner in which they worked with other agencies, and their approach to handling suspected serial crimes were all affected by the lessons learned from Gacy's case. In the years following his arrest, the FBI also began to focus more on studying the patterns and behaviors of serial killers, which helped authorities to identify other predators before they could strike. The media's obsession with Gacy's story only grew after his death. His name became a permanent fixture in the annals of criminal history, a figure that was both terrifying and fascinating. His crimes were so bizarre and grotesque that people couldn't look away. Documentaries, TV specials, and books continued to be produced, each one dissecting the case from a new angle. Gacy's personal life, his background, and even his artwork he took up painting while in prison became subjects of intense interest. Yet, in a way, Gacy's legacy lives on, not just in his crimes, but in the lessons they taught society about vigilance, trust, and the capacity for evil in the human heart. His case raised questions about how we perceive others, how we interact with those we consider normal, and how we protect vulnerable members of society. John Wayne Gacy may have been a man who wore the mask of civility while committing unthinkable acts, but his story also serves as a cautionary tale, one that reminds us that evil can take many forms and can hide behind the most unsuspecting faces. As the years passed, after John Wayne Gacy's death, the memory of his crimes remained inextricably tied to the city of Chicago. His house on Summerdale Avenue, the site where the murders occurred, was demolished, but the land remained an eerie reminder of the horrors that had taken place there. The address itself became infamous, a dark chapter in Chicago's history. For years, locals continued to speak in hushed tones about the man who had lived there, his name forever linked with a brutal legacy.